This week, What the Papers Say is presented by Mark Lawson of The Independent.
Hello. This morning in a page 2 comment, the Daily Mirror hailed a famous legal victory, saying of its architect,
"Every woman will cheer him, every decent man will join in."
And who deserved this acclaim and why?
Yesterday, the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Lane, said the appeal court's decision removes a fiction which had become outdated and offensive.
Lord Lane, but surely, as the Daily Express noted this morning,
Only 4 years ago, at the last appeal by the Six, Lord Lane insisted that he was convinced the Six were guilty.
in fact, the Mirror was praising Lord Lane for his part in yesterday's decision to acknowledge the possibility of marital rape. About Lord Lane's other decision, to uphold the forced separation of Irish married couples for 16 years, this morning's papers were rather less kind.
There has been a terrible mistake. It requires not just a royal commission, but a resignation. The man who bears responsibility is the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Lane. It is time he threw in his wig.
In allocating blame for this terrible mistake, the Daily Telegraph editorial this morning should be commended for its willingness to identify all the culprits.
That it has been so long delayed partly reflects the reluctance of the government, the judiciary, the police, and, yes, sections of the media, including this newspaper, to accept that an error of this gravity could have been made.
As in the case of the Guildford Four, for whom the jailer's keys were turned by Yorkshire Television, the Birmingham Six have been freed more by television, particularly Granada's World in Action, than by print journalism. The indifferent record of newspapers continued this morning. The Birmingham Six failed to make the lead story of the Daily Mirror.
Dies major clangor, true blue slip-up as the Princess praises Premier.
While the Daily Express chose to inform the Six that they would not be paying the community charge.
Major axes poll tax.
But today seemed to have taken the most bizarre angle on the story.
We're in love.
A jail romance? No, those were two Labour MPs. Today had cleared no page 1 space at all for the Six. The Sun did give the story prominence, but with a perhaps characteristic sense of values.
£500,000 payday. Birmingham Six to cash in as they go free after 16 years.
This tendency to view the men's ordeal as an elongated game of Monopoly, go directly to jail, wait 16 years, collect $500,000, was shared by the Star, which in this game of judicial bingo doubled the Sun's money.
Birmingham Six make it £1 million each.
In the week's other major developments, the newspapers carried further evidence of a disturbing epidemic. It can no longer be denied that against all the laws of probability and statistics, people called Norman have quietly taken over the world. Until recently, the use of Norman was restricted to fictional or factual baddies, Mr. Bates in Psycho, Mr. Tebbit in the Tory Party, Mr. Hunter in the Leeds United back four, or as a surname, Greg the golfer, Barry the film buff. Who would have bet then on the possibility of a sex symbol called Norman? But in Wednesday's Daily Mail, Linda Lee Potter reported,
General Schwarzkopf has been voted America's most sexually desirable man. Stormin Norman is 56, overweight, balding.
Indeed, not worth waiting for, you might think, but Ms. Lee Potter had identified a shift in the female psyche.
They thought they wanted a sensitive soul, prepared to be a house husband, and now find they like the idea of an old-fashioned hero, taking control, making them feel frail and fragile, not merely a good sort.
And so, after their 2-decade struggle to become sensitive new men, confused males now discover that the real way to a woman's heart is to win a war, while inflicting mass fatalities on the other side. Although there's no doubt that Stormin Norman made Iraqi women feel
frail and fragile,
and certainly made the earth move for them. But perhaps young men would be better off simply changing their names to Norman. Possessors of this proud old designation are everywhere. While Stormin Norman besieged American womankind, a Daily Express article headlined,
Treachery and the albatross of poll tax spell defeat.
revived the media career of,
The Right Honourable Norman Tebbit.
and while the Chancellor, Norman Lamont, prepared his first budget, the Sunday Times continued its unique double front of columnists.
Norman Stone, Norman McRae.
And these two Normans are really storming at the moment. Exhilarated by the military success of their US Army namesake, General Schwarzkopf, they've turned their prose fire on all those, significantly few of them called Norman, who questioned Allied military objectives in the Persian Gulf. On the first Sunday after the ceasefire, Norman Stone wrote,
I have lately been contemplating what sort of penitence we should impose upon the various people who, directly or indirectly, offered aid and comfort to Saddam Hussein.
Well, yes, Many people have been reflecting on whether or not there should be Iraqi war crimes trials and what action might be taken against Western arms dealers. But Professor Stone does not mean those people who
offered aid and comfort to Saddam Hussein.
Oh no, he means
Oberon War, Enoch Powell, Amor Thompson, the Right Honourable Anthony Wedgwood Benn.
Odd that the new technology, egalitarian, Sunrise Sunday Times should be so unwilling to accept that a man can renounce a viscountcy and call himself Tony.
Edward Heath, Dennis Healy.
What, as newspaper competitions like to ask, do these people have in common? Stone explained.
All were very wrong. The people who deserve the greatest punishment, each other, are the supposed statesmen who should have understood something about the modern world. The rest deserve to be immured in a version of Sartre's Huey Clos, in which hell is the allies with whom you're perpetually cooped up.
Oberon War, Emma Thompson, Dennis Healy and the others may have thought that they were merely exercising their democratic right to express an opinion. But Stone spoke of punishment, and his fellow Norman, Mr. McCrae, wrote with similar relish of the need to give Western dissenters a seeing to.
Much of the peace lobby's talk about the
thousands of body bags once the land war starts
was malevolent moonshine to harass soldiers' relatives, born out of complete ignorance.
And yet it has generally been accepted as fact that the US Army sent 45,000 body bags to the battle zone, which suggested that they expected rather more fatalities than occurred. And Stone and McCrae might note that even a fellow Norman, General Schwarzkopf, has described the casualty figures as miraculous, which indicates that he may attribute the final toll to luck or fate as much as judgment. Perhaps then Mr. McCrae should have included General Schwarzkopf and whoever ordered all those body bags among the purveyors of
malevolent moonshine.
Operating in a precision pincer movement against all those non-Normans who had disagreed with them, the Sunday Times' two Normans touching looked out for each other in the heat of the battle. Norman Stone, with reference to editorials in The Guardian which had upset him, wrote,
on August the 27th, the editorial fires at our own Norman McCrae for thinking that immediate action in the Gulf by the Allies would be a
3-day turkey shoot.
And right he was. A turkey shoot it has been. Norman McCrae's only inaccuracy was to say 3 days rather than 4.
His only inaccuracy? There's something rather touching about the way in which Norman I assumes that The Guardian was criticising Norman II for suggesting that Norman III's military action would take only 3 days. It seems not to have occurred to Norman I that the concept of war as a turkey shoot might have been the offensive element of the sentence. On yet another page of the same edition, the reader found,
Is it time for the Jeremiahs to eat their words?
How the prophets of doom lost face.
These included the remark by Tony Benn on September the 1st, 4 months before the start of the air war, that
such a conflict would inflict the most terrible hardship on millions of innocent people.
Well, it did, didn't it? Admittedly only Iraqis, but even so.
And could cost the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians.
Well, it did, didn't it? Admittedly only Iraqis, but even so.
With consequences that cannot be calculated.
Well, they can't be even now, can they? What does the Sunday Times have in mind? Might there be war crimes trials of the glummer pundits at the Groucho Club? Apart from the question of the fairness of the Sunday Times indulging in what we might call the mother of all gloats, there is also the problem of whether such a position is wise. In attacking the Jeremiah tendency, the paper indicates a confidence that it has always belonged to the tendency of Nostradamus. A prophet, my lad. And yet look now at the Sunday Times front page of February 3rd.
Saddam gives local commanders go-ahead for chemical attacks.
Question of when, not if, says the Pentagon.
But was the Pentagon arraigned in the Jeremiah's gallery? Was the editor who gave this alarming prediction, particularly terrifying for the relatives of the troops, such prominence? Oddly enough, no. And the paper's defense correspondent, James Adams, was to be found in September running down the potential of our boys' Challenger tanks in a most, well, Jeremiah-like way.
Margaret Thatcher,
a former British Prime Minister, my lad,
has become so incensed by the tank's alleged shortcomings that she made it clear to the manufacturers last week that the 120 machines heading for Saudi Arabia had better work.
In fact, they were to prove to have a rather more glittering future than she would have. The papers must be thankful that readers traditionally have short memories. Robert Maxwell also benefited this week from the short-term recall, or imperfect cuttings libraries, of the American press, as his own Daily Mirror reported on Wednesday in an unusually modest page 2 side column.
It's a news deal.
Mirror publisher Robert Maxwell is the new owner of the New York Daily News, the city's biggest circulation newspaper until the unions went on strike last year. New Yorkers hailed him as the paper's savior.
And what a very touching picture is summoned up. of anorexic Manhattanites and beefy Brooklyners yelling from the sidewalks, "You're our saviour, Captain Bob!" But in fact, the Mirror's claim about its proprietor seems to have been a fairly low level of inflation. The British reports, at least in newspapers he didn't own, depicted Maxwell in the usual wry light.
Yeah, it's been a long week, and common sense has prevailed,
said Mr. Maxwell, wearing a blue Daily News baseball cap.
A detail which, even in a supposedly serious business story, is clearly an invitation to giggle. But the American press was significantly more respectful. The Robert Maxwell presented to American newspaper readers this week might not be immediately recognizable to many in Britain, particularly perhaps to those of his editors who have recently found themselves spending more time with their families. In Monday's New York Times, a typically exhaustive full-page profile of Maxwell insisted that,
after he bought the Daily Mirror, Mr. Maxwell's imprint and face were all over the paper. Stories of his own exploits were regularly reported. When the Mirror started a circulation-boosting bingo contest, Mr. Maxwell's picture was on every card.
The striking American unions might, you suspect, have read this paragraph with a certain alarm. 4 days previously, the paper's chief union negotiator, George MacDonald, had told a presumably scab reporter from the strike-hit Daily News that he would
Trust this guy with everything I can, till I see how he comes. It's the only way we can start.
Now, reading the New York Times profile, MacDonald could have been forgiven a vision of his printers returning to work to print the name Maxwell rather frequently. Note, however, the New York Times' careful use of the past tense. The next paragraph began,
But after a short while, when it became apparent that the approach was counterproductive, Mr. Maxwell changed and now meddles less in the paper's daily operations.
This theory of an increasingly hands-off Captain Bob will have come as a surprise to at least two people. For, as Maggie Brown had noted in The Independent as recently as last week,
Robert Maxwell once said he saw his editors as brigadiers.
I believe in editors on top, managers on tap.
But in the past month, the Mirror Group's officer class has sustained heavy casualties. First came Ian Watson's removal from the editor's chair at the Ailing European. Now, after 14 months as editor of the Daily Mirror, Roy Greenslade is departing by mutual consent.
and yet on Tuesday the New York Times continued to encourage the perception that Maxwell was a liberal alternative to the News's current management.
It's never right, nor good, nor pleasant to lose one's job, nor to be the instrument of negotiation through which jobs are lost.
Mr. Maxwell said.
Perhaps the American Union should have faxed to them urgently the full-page signed editorial which Mr. Maxwell published in 1985 during a dispute with the British print unions. This showed perhaps a rather more sanguine attitude.
Fleet Street. The party is over.
The gravy train has hit the buffers. It looks as if the good life would never end, but now it is about to.
Only time will show whether, if the deal goes through, the New York Daily News will be run by an agonizing liberal who stays well clear of the day-to-day management, as Maxwell has been depicted in America. But there was a hint of opposition from Drivers' Union Chief Mike Alvino.
I'm willing to give, but I'm not willing to let him have the whole farm. I'm trying to keep the back quarter acre for the people.
But Britons know that to Robert Maxwell, the people is something to be bought and sold. The People newspaper, my lad.
My object all sublime, I shall achieve in time, to let the punishment fit the crime, the punishment fit the crime, and to make his prison a pent, oh, unwillingly represent a source of innocent merriment, of innocent merriment. All prosy, dull society sinners who chatter and bleat and bore are sent to his sermons some mystical Germans